if you want to go ahead. We still have folks joining us, but it's slowed down some.
All right. Thank you, Jill. Well, good morning and welcome. I'm Christy Paley, Upper Cumberland Regional Coordinator with the Tennessee Commission on Children and Youth, and we sincerely thank our co-sponsors of this event, Robertson County Juvenile Court and the Springfield Police Department. This training has been approved by the Police Officers Standards and Training for Post-Certification and Continuing Education Units. We are indeed grateful to the Springfield Police Department for obtaining the post-certification for this training and the Tennessee chapter of the National Association of Social Workers for approving the CEU credits. If you are law enforcement personnel and watching this WebEx as a group, it is a post-credit requirement that the lead person email Susan Cope. She is our Mid-Cumberland Regional Coordinator, and that is Susan, S-U-S-A-N, .cope, C-O-P-E, @tn.gov, with the full name and email address of the person who signed into the WebEx training event, and attach your email, a sign-in sheet with the names, signatures, and email addresses of all who are watching using this email address. Post CEU or participant certificates will be mailed within the next 3 weeks. All law enforcement personnel are required to provide their training officer with a copy of the certificate in order to obtain credit for this training. If for any reason you do not receive your certificate by the end of October, you may again contact Susan Cope for that certificate. A special note to all those calling into the training today, if you need a participant or a CEU certificate, please also email Susan Cope with your name and certificate request so we can capture your participation. Please type your questions in the chat box as we move through the presentation today, and our speaker, Becky Haas, will address them at the end of the presentation. Also, please refrain from using the Q&A as we will only be monitoring the chat box. You will be muted, as Jill mentioned, so we do not experience any audio interference. And again, this training will be recorded. Time and attendance will be monitored for CEU certificates as requirements dictate full participation today. So at this time, I'd like to introduce our Executive Director, Richard Kennedy, to share a few words.
Thank you, Christy. Hello, everyone. My name is Richard Kennedy, as Christy said, and I have the great privilege to serve as the Executive Director of the Tennessee Commission on Children and Youth. And it makes me so happy to scroll through the participant list and see so many folks that we've worked with many times in the past. So happy Friday, and thank you all for spending your Friday morning with us. I want to specifically thank Susan Cope, our Mid-Cumberland Regional Coordinator, for really organizing and leading the work around this webinar today, but I also really want to thank all of her peers, the 8 other regional coordinators across the state who continue to just do incredible work with organizing webinars and learning opportunities during these continued unusual times for us. I appreciate the way that they have adapted to deliver the work, and so appreciate the way that you all continue to engage with what the coordinators and what the agency does. I also want to take an opportunity to thank each of you that have joined us on the webinar. I know it's been a crazy time for us. I know that we've had to learn to do our work in many new ways. I know that we've had some things that have been wildly successful and some things that we've had to kind of tweak and figure out how to do in a different way. And I'm 100% certain it's that way with your work as well. So I know in addition to everything that you do to take care of your families and those that you love, you still continue every day to provide incredible services to the children, youth, and families across the state. And if no one has taken the opportunity to thank you today for that, I want to be the one to do that. So please know that you're appreciated, and all of your hard work does not go unnoticed. So my job today is to introduce our presenter, Becky Haas. And Becky has a very lengthy bio. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit some of the really high parts of that, and then I'm going to post a link in the chat section so you can click on that and just read all of the amazing things this lady has done and continues to do. And I'm certain that you will be as impressed as we are every time that we read this information. But Becky Haas is an experienced presenter and nationally recognized for her work in implementing trauma-informed care. She is a pioneer in developing a model for building trauma-informed communities. Her seasoned presentation experience includes trips to Delaware, presenting to state leadership at the invitation of their First Lady, as well as training juvenile justice systems in both Virginia and Tennessee. And she's a highly sought-out trainer for educators, often working directly with school superintendents to impact entire school districts in beginning their journey to create trauma-sensitive schools. Becky is unique to the field of trauma-informed care trainers due to her many years in the law enforcement field throughout her career. For 6 years, she served as the lead child passenger safety instructor under a Governor's Highway Safety Office grant-funded program at East Tennessee State University. In this role, she was responsible for training officers in 33 counties of East Tennessee and providing support for their child passenger safety efforts. She later was employed by the Johnson City Police Department as the director of an $800,000 Office of Criminal Justice Programs grant-funded Targeted Community Care Prevention Program. The TCCRP grant was aimed at reducing drug-related and violent crime in the two neighborhoods where historically these types of crimes prevailed. Becky earned her professional certification in trauma and resilience from Florida State University and has completed courses in trust-based relational intervention and trauma-informed classrooms from Texas Christian University. She has been certified as a trauma-informed care trainer by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, Gain Center, and the Tennessee Building Strong Brains program. Becky has been the recipient of numerous personal awards, including a Regional Women's Tribute Award as a Transformational Woman in 2019, the Anita Steiner Award from Goodwill Industries for implementing job skills training into the reentry community, and was inducted into the Social Work Honor Society at King University for her above and beyond contributions, which embody the heart and mission of the social work profession. Becky is married to Jonathan, and their greatest joys in life are their 2 sons and their growing family. Please join me in welcoming, and I will pass things off to our presenter today, Becky Haas. Thank you, Becky.
Thank you, Richard. And thank you, and appreciate all the TCCY family and friends. Really a lot of the work that Richard referred to there in my introduction, much of that wouldn't have been possible without my partnership with TCCY. Their great leadership in the state in advancing trauma-informed care, building strong brains, ACE's mobilization. So it's really a joy to present to you today. I'll get right to the training because we are going to use our full 3 hours, and except for a short break. And so, as Richard said, I learned about trauma-informed care while working for the Johnson City Police Department. So after training 4,000 individuals in a cross-sector of professionals, I knew that there had to be a way to present this through a policing lens. And there's also, some of this could be applied to justice. There are more specific trainings that I've used when I train juvenile justice systems. But today you're really going to hear this topic framed up through a policing lens. So after many months of research, because I knew that police officers needed to hear this content from their peers, and though I'm no stranger to training police officers, I knew that the content needed to be what was recommended by their peers. And so some of the content today is from the International Chiefs Association, the Vera Institute, and some highly really respected publications and evidence-based practices in law enforcement. All right, so with that, here we go. So why should officers, why should law enforcement or SROs, why should you learn about trauma? So throughout this training today, I'm going to bring home the point that you learning about trauma is not going to change your role per se in the justice field. However, it is going to give you a new lens to understand how many individuals that you serve that are trauma survivors. So this training is about how being trauma-informed can actually improve criminal justice system outcomes. It's not about the treatment of trauma. My goal today is not to turn everyone in law enforcement into a counselor per se, but you're going to see as we advance through this training that you can have a therapeutic role even though you yourself are not a therapist, okay? Many times law enforcement, you are the intervention on scene. So today's training is going to address three ways trauma is in the world of law enforcement, all right? And that is through trauma on scene for those that are served. Officers are very often involved in situations that to the rest of us and the public, the citizens they serve, sometimes those are the most traumatic incidents of our life, whether it was some sort of victimization or intrusion or burglary or a car accident, then the officers are on scene. But to us that are involved in those situations, there's trauma. So today's training is going to help you especially see how to reduce trauma on scene for children. And then we're going to talk about community trauma. Ever since the tragic death of Mr. Floyd earlier this year at the hands of police brutality, it's become apparent that officers need to understand the connection between the safety of their community and their connection to it. And so we're going to talk about how to reduce community trauma, and then we're going to wind it up by talking about the officer trauma, the trauma that an officer experiences in the line of duty. So some of the benefits of this training is that the key to changing how we think about things is by understanding. So if we think about someone is, violent or out of control, then it would make sense to act by force. But if we view an individual as afraid and desperate, and maybe where we understand some things about the brain science of trauma, then we know that it's really better for all if we respond by creating a sense of safety. So as I developed this training, actually working for police, I vetted it with much conversation by the officers in my department. Hold on a minute. I'm trying to reduce this little thing. There we go. And so this was one topic that actually surprised me when I worked for police and viewed the actual day-to-day, was that the nature of police work, even though we refer to police work as law enforcement, enforcing the law, that's really only one of several functions that police perform, and that the functions of police also include basic social services. I remember talking with one of our watch commanders, one of our captains of our investigative unit, when I was developing this training about this particular point, and he said when he came on the force 30 years ago that he felt like, that he was going to be, doing the things, apprehending bad guys, criminal, investigations, that kind of thing. And he said, many days I go home feeling more like a social worker or a preacher, where the types of work that you're involved in are not always in apprehending crime. And as recent as June of 2020, an article appeared in the New York Times, and they did a review of data of 10 police departments, including the ones that are relatively high violent crime rates, the 10 cities that have the highest violent crime rates. And after that review of data, they saw that police officer time was only 1% of their time was actually in responding to violent crime. So again, it brings home the message that police are involved in all kinds of services. So police respond to calls for help to people that are in emergencies of all kind of description. Okay, I'm not sure why it won't go forward. Hold on a minute. Okay. So the learning objectives in Module 1, we're going to gain a shared understanding of trauma so that we all kind of have the same idea of the concept. We're going to recognize how trauma affects the brain, and then we're going to be able to identify trauma. Trauma is kind of like the wind. You don't really see the wind. What you see are the effects of the wind, and that's what we're going to cover in this training. Then we're going to talk about the science that got a lot of this conversation started, the actual ACEs study, Adverse Childhood Experiences study, and then we're going to be aware of how much trauma is involved in our community. And I always want to slow down at the beginning of my training and just address the audience. First of all, thank you for coming today. But we'd be remiss to not mention that many of us ourselves are trauma survivors. And so as we proceed through the training, some of the topics that we talk about are going to be sensitive in nature. I'm kind of a storyteller. I'm sure through this training I'm going to tell many stories, real stories that have happened to officers that have related to me or others in the justice field. And so I just want you to know at any point through the training, if you need to, step away, get a drink of water, that kind of thing, the last thing we want to do, the overarching rule of trauma-informed care is do no harm. And so in bringing up things that might stir up memories or anything like that, the last thing we want in any kind of training on this topic is to, bring somebody at a place of where it's hard on you. So as we advance through this, we just want you to be aware some of the topics may be sensitive, and so feel free to, take a little break if you need to. Okay, so understanding trauma, we pretty much all the trainings I do, whether it's hospital trainings, educator trainings, in any field, justice, it's really critical for us to understand the difference between empathy and sympathy. And I know from working with police that police wear a very heavy tool belt out into the field, even though there's quite a weight of it, that it's still your most essential equipment as you go out in the field. And as we are going to see a video here in just a minute, I want you to think about wearing empathy every day, that as you go out, and many of you that are on this training today that are in the justice field, you're going to see that there are already ways where you are front line in showing empathy. But I just want you to see how that the difference between empathy and sympathy is critical in our role. And sometimes just the smallest statements that we can give to someone on scene to validate that they're in hardship goes a long way in helping trauma survivors to heal. So I want to thank Jill Stott, who's my trusty helper today in showing the videos, and she's going to take it away.
So what is empathy?
All right. So in the video there, Brene Brown does a great job of explaining the two, sympathy and empathy. Sympathy, where the one animal is saying, at least you've done this, at least you've had that. But empathy is different. Empathy might be arriving at a domestic violence call, and as officers are arresting a perpetrator, giving information about maybe one of the statewide family justice centers to the victim, and just a few statements about, ma'am, we're sorry this has happened. When I was training healthcare workers working for a regional healthcare system, we would train in our training for ER nurses, sometimes that would see individuals who came in as victims of some sort of violent activity, just to be able to make some empathetic statements that we know from research go a long way in bringing about healing to trauma survivors. So think on this slide here how that members of law enforcement often are the only one called to a situation or on scene of a situation that is highly traumatic, the suicide of a teenager or any individual, or a child drowning or sexual assault or domestic violence. And even in my own life, in 2005, my 72-year-old father was home with my mother, and my mother went out to run a few errands for a few hours. And when she returned home, my father had had a massive heart attack and died. And so obviously she texted me, called me, and I came from work. She called 911. And when I arrived, just 5 minutes after she called me, and Dad didn't even take any medication for any kind of a heart problem. So we were totally just, caught off guard by the shock of this. And the EMS was coming out and saying, we're sorry, he's gone. And this happened just a few days in September after Hurricane Katrina. And so when law enforcement came, they stayed in our home, in my mother's home, on the either side of the bed where my father's body lay, for almost 4.5 hours so we could find a coroner, because many of the coroners locally had gone to Louisiana to work through the situation that Katrina caused. And I cannot tell you what a comfort those two officers were standing there in the bedroom for all those hours, just doing the things that they do. And so we see that many times, because officers are the individuals on scene, how that they are facilitators of empathy. So what is trauma? So for this training, we're going to go with the SAMHSA definition. Trauma results from an event, a series of events, a set of circumstances that are experienced by an individual that are physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, that can have lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning in many ways, mentally, physically, socially, emotionally, and even spiritually. So that's a mouthful, so we're going to break down those E's one at a time. So the first E are potential traumatic events. Now, the reason I say potential is that two of us on this training today could experience the same event, and while it's traumatic for one, it's not for another. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in the training. A lot of that has to do with your own support system. But if you look in this, the three different columns, officers are going to be involved a lot in the column labeled abuse, whether it's physical abuse, domestic violence, bullying, assault, those types of things. But we want to think about institutional abuse. I'm working with the state now and their prison system, and many years ago, the federal guidelines came out around the PREA, the education that correctional officers have to have to underscore how much sometimes sexual violation takes place in a prison, where you think in a prison that there would be safety for all, but sometimes, sadly, that's not the case. So sometimes people can suffer abuse in some sort of a institutional type service. Or there's the column of loss, which, again, some of the things that we talk about here could be some of our story, the death of a loved one, as I experienced with my father. Or look at natural disaster. In the state of Tennessee, earlier this year, Cookeville experienced a tornado touching down, and I believe that it was on the ground for about 50 miles. I have a son and a daughter-in-law that my son attends Tennessee Tech there in Cookeville, and forever that situation changed their their life. We're grateful that they were safe, but 18 people lost their life during the night that night. And so my son and daughter-in-law volunteered with Samaritans, the cleanup, some of the relief programs that came, and they told me that, after that, the signs emerged, shirts emerged, hashtags emerged, Cook Feels Strong, and so sometimes we see communities rally after a natural disaster, even a few years ago, the Gatlinburg fire. So those can be traumatic events. And then there's the chronic stressors of poverty and racism, and maybe a family that has a loved one undergoing a long-standing medical situation, or a family who has a family member diagnosed with mental illness or addiction, or family members incarcerated. So all of these situations potentially could be traumatic. The second E is the experience of that event. So it's the individual's experience, not necessarily the event itself, that's traumatizing. And much of what impacts that experience can be, how did it happen? When did it happen? Where? How often? And who's involved? So again, when I was working on this, developing this training content, working for police, I spent some time talking to our child crimes investigator, and she was telling me that about 95% of the time in the homicide that she would investigate on children 2 years old or younger, that it was involved, that the death of the child came through as a result of the neglect of a known caregiver. So many times what heightens the experience of the traumatic event is because it's dealt out through the hands or the experience of someone that we know. It's not at the hands of a stranger, even though certainly that can be traumatic, but many times it's through someone that we know. And then the third E is the effects of trauma. So trauma creates symptoms that we want to refer to as we proceed in this training as adaptations. So what you may come on scene as a law enforcement officer, or you may see as a problem behavior in a school as a school resource officer, I want you to start to shift your thinking that instead of this being a problem, that it's now become the person's solution in navigating the trauma they're experiencing in their life. So the effect of trauma on an individual can become conceptualized as a normal response to an abnormal situation. So during my tenure at the Johnson City Police Department, under the grant that I was a director of, one of the interventions that I was tasked with as director was to start a program to reduce recidivism. So I pulled together the judges of the 1st Judicial District, our DA, our mental health provider, our probation and parole, Tennessee Department of Corrections, and we had these long conversations on what was needed to help to reduce recidivism in our area. And we came up with a program called the Day Reporting Center. And, I'm super proud to have had a part in that program. At the end of my grant, it was acquired by the Tennessee Department of Tennessee Department of Corrections as a program now they've used as a model to replicate statewide to reduce recidivism. And so in working to develop this program, the judges wanted it to be a program for high-risk, high-need felony offenders with addictions. So if you're not aware of the Tennessee Department of Corrections Day Reporting Center, in a nutshell, what it is it's a prison diversion. So when someone is out on probation for a crime or around drug activity or crime that is drug activity, and they violate probation, if there's a day reporting center in their community, the judge can order them to go to the DRC. And the DRC is, about 12 to 15 months long. The individual moves along at their own pace, moves along at their own pace, and then they graduate. And I know when I was involved, boy, those graduations are fun. But spending almost 4 years overseeing the development of that program, I heard stories that I'll never forget. And professionals, I want to remind you as we go through this training today that, I could be you and you could be me. No one on this earth picks where they show up in life. And, some of the individuals that were involved in that program, I would hear stories, as I did from one young woman, how that her youngest memories of her mother was a heroin addict, and her youngest memories of her mother was when her mother would shoot up with heroin. that she would be with her in the bathroom because her mother would get violently sick. And so this young girl would be tasked with pulling her mother out of the commode while she was vomiting after the drug use, while her sister is just screaming across the house, "Let her drown, let her drown." And one day in the group, she began to tell about how that her mother one time left for a few weeks, and her older sister was now 10. She was 8. And they had a brand new baby sister, 4 weeks old, and how that they didn't know how to reach the mother, where the mother was. And these little girls were placing a mirror under the infant's nose every few hours to see if breath was coming out of it. And finally, after 2 weeks, when the baby got very sick, they called in a grandparent. And I said to her that day, I said, "Why didn't you tell anyone at school? Or why didn't you, talk to a neighbor or call the grandparents sooner?" And her response was that they felt that this was very typical, that other people must live the same way. And when their mom has a drug party at night, that you're locked in your room without any supper. And so things that to us would not make at all any sense, that becomes a normalized situation to someone that has experienced these traumatic events over and over. So survival mode is something we all may experience in our life, but it's not meant to be how you live your life. All right, so we want to then see again that behavior equals survival. When I worked 18 months in healthcare, it's very critical that doctors diagnose the symptoms that someone presents with of what disease it is so that treatment can begin to go into place. But now when I work with school superintendents to bring trauma-informed lens into their school, oftentimes educators have been trained how to deal with willful behavior, but now we're learning that trauma is really presenting us survival behavior. So now sometimes some of the children that maybe they wanted in the past to be the most punitive with, now because of understanding trauma, now they're being protective of those children. Again, it doesn't mean we don't adhere to rules. It doesn't mean there's times where there are disciplinary acts, but now we're beginning to do them through a trauma-informed lens. So behavior manifests the effects of trauma manifest behaviorally, and they can show up in many ways that seemingly are unrelated. Behavior is a coping mechanism. People with long-term abuse, they're going to figure out how to best avoid getting hurt. People that are often going to use alcohol and drugs at an early age as a type of self-medicating or defensive aggression. People that expect aggression often will strike out first. So what could traumatic stress look like on scene to those in law enforcement or those that are joining us today from the juvenile justice? Maybe if you work in a detention center, thanks to the help of Jill, my TCCY local regional director, we were able to provide training for the staff at a local detention center who heretofore really never thought about maybe some of the background of the young people that were being brought into the detention center. So look over the list here of physical and emotional type reactions. And now when you see these reactions, instead of just looking at the behavior itself, kind of for the cover value, think about maybe it could be a sign that someone is a trauma survivor. And here's some of the cognitive type of behaviors that go with trauma-informed activity. If an officer was to question someone and they appear confused, having a hard time making decisions, well, an officer might interpret that as they're hiding the truth, not wanting to come forward, which that could be an interpretation of it, but it also might be that individual is overwhelmed with trauma. Someone that's preoccupied with the events, their thoughts are fixated on particular things. Sometimes people experience disassociation. I'm going to tell a story at the end about officer self-care, where an officer told me after witnessing something, they felt out of their body for a couple of weeks because of the horror around that event. And so all of these things are totally characteristic to a trauma survivor's behavior. And again, here's some more descriptive words that talk about the behavior of a trauma survivor. Someone that might be pacing, agitated, darting eyes. I know if an officer's questioning someone and they're not wanting to focus on them, they could interpret that as being, avoiding the truth or making up, bringing out lies or whatever. But when someone's hypervigilant, if the bear runs in the room one time, pretty much after that, if you hear the word bear for some time, you're going to be on high alert. And the same is true with a trauma survivor. And so some of the cues here, even for children, that children might be clingy or fussy or running around, all those things are characteristic of trauma survivors. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about how trauma affects brain development, and we're going to see 3 little, about 1.5-minute videos that are going to play one by one, back to back, and then I'll comment on them. Okay. Thank you for the videos. All right. So let's just talk real quickly about each of those. The first one was all about how the brain develops around a system, just kind of like an architect's drawings for a building. My husband actually is a contractor, so I've seen many a roll of those big set of drawings. And what's interesting is there's the drawings for the foundation, the drawings for the plumbing, the drawings for the electrical. So it's a very complicated process. And the same is true in the development of a child's brain. The way that the paths are developed is by use. And so if a child is not using a certain area of the brain, then it's not developing in the way that it should be. The second video talked about a process that's essential to that brain development, and that is called serve and return. So if you are a tennis pro that's on the training today, you've never won a tennis match playing by yourself. You have to have an opponent. And so a child has to have a nurturing caregiver that is doing the responding to reading a book, saying some numbers, or the ABCs, or taking a trip to the zoo, or just when a child cries out for help, that a caregiver is there to soothe and comfort them. And all that is essential for a child's brain development. And then the third one showed how that toxic stress actually derails brain development. And so what that means is that the part of the brain that a child needs to develop, where the thinking, reasoning, emotional regulation takes place, those areas are not going to be developed if the child, A, does not have a nurturing caregiver that is involved in their life, and B, if they're subject to toxic stress or ongoing trauma, so like some of the events that we mentioned a few slides ago. So on this slide, we see a little diagram of the brain, and you see the top of the brain, the cerebral cortex. That's a part of the brain that I'm referring to as the upper part of the brain. But if you'll notice at the base of the brain, there's a little piece like a pea pod shape that's labeled amygdala. So for the purpose of this training, we're calling the amygdala the fire alarm. And so that we all have an amygdala. We all would need an amygdala from time to time. And when it goes to work, when our life feels overwhelmed or threatened, our safety threatened, then our amygdala goes to work and it shuts down the upper part of our brain. So that's why it's often hard to think in a crisis. Now, the thing about the amygdala is our survival mechanisms are only three: fight, flight, or freeze. And this is very important to people in law enforcement because that's a lot of the behavior, if not almost all, that you're going to encounter on scene is fight, flight, or freeze in individuals that you engage with. So I want you to really take to heart that this is survival mechanism behavior that you're on scene, and how critical it is that you maintain control over what area of your brain that you're operating out of, because that's going to bring about the best decisions, the best response. And you know, how many people work a job like law enforcement that every day that you get up and go into work, or every night that you work a night shift, that your job can be filled with different things that are totally different from the day before. And so there's sometimes not a lot of regularity. Maybe it's some of the same kind of calls, but it could involve different scenarios. So you're kind of like an air traffic controller. And so you need to be coming on the job with the best, decision-making process. And when you understand about brain development, that's going to help you as a law enforcement professional as well. So here's a very compelling slide. I use it in many of my presentations. I believe it's in the Tennessee Building Strong Brains curriculum, which I'm a trainer for as well. So here we see an MRI image of two different children. One is labeled healthy brain and one is labeled abused brain. And if you'll notice the circled areas, those are areas that are the upper part of the brain, learning center, where emotional regulation and all would come from. And notice in a child that has the healthy brain, the areas are very colorful because this child's had a lot of adult interaction and engagement, the serve and return process going on. But then notice on the other side, the circled areas, how much is missing out of that child's brain. And while it's labeled an abused brain, I would probably more call it a neglected brain. This is a brain of a child the same age, They grew up in an orphanage in Romania. And I have one of my younger sisters. She and her husband adopted a child many, many years ago from China. And when they went to the orphanage, there were about 200 children and only about 6 adult caregivers for 200 children. And so when my little niece, who's now about to graduate from college, when she first came into our lives, she would rock herself to sleep at night, because my sister and her husband learned that when the small amount of caregivers per ratio of the large amount of children, that every night at 7 o'clock, the children that could walk were tied to their bed by their ankle. And that's how the staff tried to control that many children and getting them settled in to go to bed. So she did not have the loving arms of a caregiver rocking her to sleep, as my sons did, or now my grandchildren did. So notice the impact on the brain by all the areas. So, if I was training educators today, I would very much point out with this slide how that we have 2 children come into our classroom sitting side by side, and their brain is not developed at the same level. And so it's kind of created a perfect storm in education that we're supposed to be able to teach the children the same. But thank goodness for trauma-informed care and ACEs science. Now we're helping teachers embed social emotional learning into the classroom that can help repair that damage that's been done to the brain. So I want you to take a look at this slide. This slide is showing some different scenarios in a law enforcement world of what trauma may look like. So in the upper left-hand corner, we see 2 officers showing empathy to some young children. And I don't know the story all around that, but I would think maybe that maybe they've witnessed something, or maybe something has happened in their home or to family members, that these officers are comforting these children. If you drop below that in the black and white image, you see 2 officers questioning someone, a woman who has actually a big bruise on her face. And so, they are involved in a traumatic situation that she's experienced. But notice this upper right-hand side. That is an image that totally portrays this understanding of brain development. You see the calm face of the officer. Now, that officer's voice, his heart might be racing, with adrenaline at just a riotous type scene there. But notice the face of the young man that he's handcuffing there. That is the face of a downstairs brain, and the officer's face is the face of the upstairs brain. And that's why, officers, that it's very critical that your face not look like that young man's face, because do you know what happens when your face looks that way? You basically wave goodbye to your training, to your emotional regulation, to your best decision-making faculties, and you're going to operate out of the amygdala, which can only do 3 things: fight, flight, or freeze. So understanding about trauma also enables officers to stay safe in situations that sometimes can really escalate and get out of control. And later in the training, we're going to talk about a few techniques that you can use to help regulate people on scene. Now, in the bottom image is a young officer with holding a child, and I did some research on this. Actually, it was a video on YouTube that went viral. I guess COVID's got viral on my mind. But this young officer pulled up on a traffic fatality, and sadly, this young girl's father was ejected from the car in a rollover and was killed. And so while other responders were attending to the father and the scene, this officer arrived to seeing this small toddler standing in the grass. And in the video, he mentioned he has a daughter the same age, and he thought, how could I comfort this little girl in this terrible time? And he picked her up and he started singing. And everyone in law enforcement, or really any profession, knows now that we work with individuals that all have smartphones, and about anything you do can be recorded. And this officer was not aware that someone in the crowd saw him pick the little girl up, and he began to sing to her in order to distract her, which was really a brilliant way to help reduce the trauma on scene for her. So these are some scenarios of what trauma may look like on scene, and just give some examples of how the brain, upstairs, downstairs brain. Okay, so we see here that all of our lives have stress. There's positive stress of public speaking, the positive stress of interviewing for a new job. I know when I worked for police, our department, they use the polygraph test as a part of the interview process, and I could always see the days the officers were lined up in the lobby, and I could tell it was probably polygraph day just because it seemed a bit stressful. But you know what? That officer's face looked a whole lot different the day that we all gathered together in the city council chambers to witness and cheer on the swearing in of a new officer, because that stress was short-lived. And then we see tolerable stress, which might be something that might be more difficult to deal with, maybe the loss of a loved one, a loss of a home in a natural disaster. But over time, that stress becomes manageable as well. But then there's the toxic stress of ongoing, for an officer, could be the ongoing trauma day after day after day of your job. Or maybe it's to a child that lives in a home where there's drug activity. You know, as I've been involved working with the public schools, I've heard stories of 15-year-olds locking themselves in their closet at night because of the drug activity of the caregiver, that when the parent was passed out, people around the drug activity was coming into their room and violating them. And so this youngster got the idea to go into the closet to try to have some safety. Professionals, when you're in that kind of a situation that is ongoing toxic stress, that is going to take its toll on our life. So, excuse me. So if we put it on a scientific chart, a graph here, we see that the positive stress of the public speaking or the polygraph, that's short-lived. It peaks up and then it becomes manageable. Or the tolerable, it peaks up and it might reoccur, but over time it becomes manageable. But look at the toxic stress, where the level of stress never goes down. And another reason I was offered a job to work for a regional healthcare system, and I did for 18 months, was because when our life reflects that third image there, that means that our amygdala is highly active and highly engaged. And when your amygdala is engaged, it's releasing a substance called cortisol, which now we know medically that too much cortisol causes certain types of cancer, as well as heart disease and other types of physical ailment. So those that are exposed to repeated trauma actually create pathways in their brain based on these events. These neural pathways are used and become familiar roads, familiar emotions, familiar habits. So imagine that you're using your GPS, but it's stuck on taking you to a location where you don't even want to go. All right, now we're going to see a video that explains ACEs science. It's about 5 minutes.
wjrfilms.co.
All right. So the ACEs study, as I said earlier, is really what got a lot of this conversation going on. Done in the late 90s, two doctors, Dr. Vincent Folletti, who worked for Kaiser Permanente, and Dr. Richard Anda, who was at the CDC. These gentlemen were both looking into the significance of childhood adversity and separate work they were doing, and they learned about each other, and they came together. And then they formulated the ACEs study. And so in the video there, you saw the actual 10 questions that were a part of the study. 5 things, did you see this before you were 18 in your home or in your life? Or 5 things, did you experience this before turning 18? And it was questions like witnessing violence in your home, or did you ever feel you wouldn't have food to eat or a place to stay, or were you, treated, beaten or sworn at, those types of things. And what they uncovered, they really never expected to uncover, and that was several things, is that when someone had an ACE score, if they said yes to one of those questions, then it was probable that they could also have more than one. So by having one, then it was likely there could be additional ACEs, and then they found that the higher the ACE score, the more certain it was this group was at significant risk for addiction, for underage alcohol use, tobacco use, eating disorders, suicide attempts, and earlier introduction to the mental health services. So this is a pretty landmark study, and now it's gaining quite a lot of traction all across the world. So as this slide says, that ACEs showed that people who have no ACEs compared to people that have ACE scores, they were 2 to 4 times more likely to use alcohol or drugs at an early age. People with an ACE score of 5 or higher are 7 to 10 times more likely to use illegal drugs, or report addiction, or inject drugs. So in this little graphic, and if you are developing any kind of training or doing presentations, you can go to the CDC website, and they actually have CDC-approved graphics that you can use that help do a great job explaining some of the concepts around ACEs. So in this graphic, we see the different 10 questions fall into 3 categories of trauma: abuse, neglect, or household dysfunction. And then what the ACEs study showed was that the effects of those different causes can produce the behavior, and the physical and mental health can make lasting impacts. And if you notice under the category there in effects of physical and mental health, again, that is why the healthcare system in our region took a great interest in this, in rolling this out in rural Appalachia as a significant social determinant to health. Matter of fact, before I left working for the healthcare system, the CEO had met with me and asked me to begin to work with the university. And at the end of the spring, they gave a $1 million 5-year gift to the university to start what is called the Strong Brain Institute. And now I'm honored to be serving as a consultant to that institute. But that's why we're going to see more and more of our health systems, our health departments, take a tremendous interest in the outlying situations that people are in, because now we know through the ACEs study that it can have an impact on their health. So here we see that ACEs, the higher the ACE score, the more likely that someone is at risk of perpetrating domestic violence. Also, we see that the underlying suicide attempts, the higher the ACE score, the more likely the same individuals will be at high risk for suicide attempts. We also see childhood experiences impact adult alcoholism. So in the area of mental health, a history of childhood trauma predicts all these things. This is data from the SAMHSA website. Earlier first admissions to mental health, more frequent longer hospital stays, more time in seclusion or restraint, greater likelihood of self-injury or suicide attempt, more medication use, and increased symptom severity. And when I was learning about this at the police department, remember, one of my jobs was creating a program for high-risk, high-need felony offenders. So, you know, it's just kind of like all of this was coming at the same time, and I was just really impacted by this ACEs study and wondered, why was it not a part of the conversation when we know how high the rates are for those in the justice system, those in the recovery network, how much trauma has been a part of their story. So again, these are national statistics. Around 65% of all substance abuse treatment clients report experiencing childhood trauma. 75% of women in substance abuse report histories of trauma. 92% of homeless mothers have severe trauma histories. In 2013, the American Journal of Public Health said homeless individuals have the highest ACE scores of any other population. I'm working with a group called the Compassion Prison Project, and they've been doing the ACEs survey in Los Angeles County prisons, which are the prison they're working in is more of a maximum security. And when I talked with them last, most of the ACE scores have been 5, 7, and higher of those that are involved in the justice system. So remember my statement at the beginning that professionals, we don't pick where we start in life. And I've heard stories of children whose mothers tried to murder them. And again, trauma is not an excuse for drugs. It's not an excuse for crime. It's not a magic eraser that we're saying, okay, we don't need to apprehend these individuals. But now it offers us an explanation for drugs. And we know most of the time when people get involved in a lifestyle of drugs, they're going to be crime to sustain it. But now it offers us an understanding of that. And hopefully more and more cities and communities are going to move to embedding trauma-informed services that are going to help those in the systems to heal. So look at this trauma prevalence in children. 71% of children exposed to violence each year. 3 million children are maltreated or neglected each year. 3.5 million to 10 million children witness violence against their mother each year. And I know from writing the Family Justice Center grant when I worked at the police department locally that statistically in America it takes 7 acts of violence before someone will report it or reach out to an advocate. Now, it's very likely and very probable that the first incident of violence will get a call to police, a 911, a second call. And professionals, after I heard a 911 call of a 4-year-old who was watching his mother being beat with a ball bat, I couldn't sleep for days after hearing that horrific call. But that is what gave me the idea that law enforcement needed to understand some simple, practical ways to reduce trauma on scene. Because I thought to myself that day, who is going to be there the first time that violent act occurs? Who's going to be there the second time, the third time? It's going to be our law enforcement professionals. If you did a ride-along today with law enforcement in your community, they could go into many neighborhoods in your town, and they know the backstory of what's going on in some of the homes there. They know some of the snapshot of what some of the children are living under. And so while we know about a lot of domestic violence, there's a lot of violence that's unreported. Interestingly, yesterday I trained a group of college students, university students in Lithuania. Lithuania leads the world in the amount of people that take their life by suicide. In Lithuania, 1 of every 3 persons that lives in Lithuania ends their life by suicide. And so I had the privilege of introducing the ACEs study to these young people in this university that have a great work going on there. And in doing some research to prepare for that training, I learned that in Lithuania, 1 of 3 women experiences violence in their home, and the least safe place for a woman to be in the country of Lithuania is in her own home. So just imagine the children that are growing up and witnessing this ongoing violence. And I had no idea that it was at the level it was until I was introduced to the ACEs study. 1 in 4 girls, 1 in 6 boys sexually abused before adulthood. But look how compelling. I noticed as people were signing on, we have many in the juvenile justice friends on today, which I'm so thrilled about. But look at this, 94% in a study of those that were involved in the juvenile justice system, almost every young person there, what they had in common was high rates of childhood trauma. Okay, so why focus on trauma in children? Because if we could reduce the amount of trauma, look at the characteristics, look at the things that our society faces that we could reduce. And so in 1979, the U.S. Surgeon General, Dr. Richmond, serving under President Carter, he declared that violence was a public health crisis of the highest priority. And here we are 41 years later, where we're just now starting to ramp up in states. And I'm proud to be a Tennessean, and the great work that TCCY and was started under Governor Haslam and Chrissy Haslam to become a trauma-informed state. And we were talking before the training began, Richard and I, that many of the states that I'm involved in the national conversation, they look back to Tennessee in some of the leadership there. But why has it taken us this long to engage in activity? And so we're long overdue for awareness, raising awareness to the trauma around many individuals growing up in the same way that we were involved in seatbelts and car seat campaigns in the past, and tobacco and smoking cessation and hand washing in the flu. And so that's what this is an opportunity to do today. All right, so we are going to pause right there, and I'm going to let Melissa come on. We're going to take a break. However, they're going to facilitate that, and we'll be back in a few minutes.
Thank you so much, Becky. We will take a 10-minute break, so we will return at 9:55. So for all of you, please take that break, and we will be posting a few reflective questions for you to just ponder upon during the break and as we prepare for the second part of Becky's presentation. So thank you again for being with us today, and we will have those posted momentarily.
Okay. I think I'm unmuted. Okay, welcome back from the break, and thank you, Christy, for those reflective questions. So we left off talking about how there's really a grave need to advocate and raise awareness to trauma, to the violence that many are living under, the toxic stress, and that's what our time today is really a part of. So we're going to see a video here. Before it plays, I want you to just know that it's a little sensitive in nature. It's a true story from the Futures Without Violence. You're going to actually hear Chad telling his story. And the reason I included it in this training is because I want you to see how Chad's hard life situation is turned around through the help of community members. Okay, the other thing I miss about doing in-person training is usually after that Chad video, there's a couple of us wiping tears out of our eyes. I hope I get to meet Chad one day. I've showed this video so many times, and I think being the mother of boys, my boys are grown and married now, but man, you feel for Chad. But look at what a difference just a teacher at school having the idea that, you know, something's not right with Chad, and then connecting him to the coach, Morrow. And you can see the genuine affection between him and the coach, you know, and how surprised he is and delighted he is to be reunited with the coach at the end of the video. So, ladies and gentlemen, in trauma-informed care services, one of the reasons, again, we're training law enforcement today is every member of the community, every service provider can have a part to play in the healing of trauma survivors. We don't have to be a therapist to have a therapeutic role, and that's what we just saw played out in the Chad video. Okay, so now we're going to get into, I love the first part, laying the foundation, but now I really love the second part, what to do with it. And in the work that I'm doing now, and honored to be doing at a national level and now even some international work, I'm really kind of identified as a practitioner. There are probably many on the TCCY team and SOCAT and some of the organizations in the state of Tennessee that have worked to roll out the trauma-informed care that, you know, might be more well-skilled in the science and the brain. And, you know, Bruce Perry and Brene Brown and Nadine Burke-Harris, some of the leaders in this field, you know, I read their books and listen to their podcasts and things, and I can put that into my trainings to articulate it. But really what has been something that's been a mission to me about learning about this topic is what to do with it. What to do with it. And I was fortunate when I learned about it at the police department that I created this great big notebook. I had 35 partnering agencies that were working with me to reduce crime. Everything from the housing authority to libraries to homeless serving agencies. And I put a tab in this notebook, and I began to research if there was a meaningful application for using trauma-informed care in service delivery and all those services. And after I filled that notebook to the place where it wouldn't close, you know, that's when I was like, all right, I'm ready to go. And so the rest of this training, we're going to talk about the practical application of trauma-informed care in a law enforcement lens. So this module, we're going to cover identifying some trauma-informed policing practices, how to reduce trauma by strengthening cultural competencies and connection, trauma-responsive approaches for officers, age-appropriate ways to reduce trauma on scene, and then lastly, we'll talk about officer self-care. So in trauma-informed policing, as well as any other profession, if you're with DCS or if you're in juvenile justice, probation, parole, whatever your role is today, there are 4 things that SAMHSA says that need to occur when you understand about trauma-informed care. Number 1, we need to realize the widespread impact of trauma. But the good news about ACEs is to understand there are potential paths for recovery. Number 2, recognize the signs and the symptoms of trauma and those involved in the system. So by you attending this 3-hour training today, pretty much we could check off box number 1 and check off box number 2. But now it brings us in our training to number 3 and 4. How are we going to respond? How are we going to respond? And we need to respond by fully integrating the knowledge about trauma into our policies, our procedures, and our practices. And then lastly, how can we offer services without re-traumatization? And that's some of the things that we'll discuss in this module. All right, so this is a video from the Vera Institute of Justice in New York with some examples of trauma-informed policing. Okay, great video. As the officer said there, the tenets for trauma-informed policing, safety and security, where you establish a sense of safety. They're on the scene. It may seem chaotic when you come on the scene, but what can you do to establish a sense of safety, particularly the people that you're serving there, to give them a sense of safety? And then the validation and ventilation, sometimes to just be able to listen, let them talk for a minute about how they feel about the situation, violated or feel unsafe, as she mentioned in the example she gave of a home invasion. So just to allow them to be able to describe that situation. And then, you can probably say, I'm sure, the Miranda rights in your sleep, and what's the process? How soon will a court date be? Or how are you going to go about, bail or different things? Because this is a world you live in. But to many individuals in the justice system, can be overwhelming and a bit frightening. And so for you to just begin to explain, and in a minute we're going to talk about when you arrest a caregiver in the presence of a child, some of the things that you can say, that just by giving some preparation and prediction can help to remove and reduce trauma on scene. Let's see. Okay, so some other examples that are ongoing nationally of trauma-informed policing. In 2005, it was the Wilmington, Delaware police that initiated this initiative. They began to review their 911 reports for domestic violence calls, and in 2004, they saw over 4,100 calls that had come in. And they knew that some of the cases there were no children in the household when the call came in, but many times there were children and more than one. So the officers in reviewing the data saw that almost half the calls did have children present. So what they did was they partnered with the Delaware Division of Child Mental Health Services so that they got a referral from the officers when there were children present during the domestic violence call. A minute ago, I mentioned that what gave me the idea that officers needed to be trained was hearing a 911 call, and I thought, who could be the intervention? But, look at how wonderful this is. If an officer then can give a referral for a welfare check or a callback from a mental health expert to check on those children. So that was launched in 2006, and in the first year and a half or 16 months, more than 1,200 children that were exposed to violence now were immediately put in touch with mental health crisis intervention. And I've been to Delaware 3 times, 2 times at the invitation of the First Lady of Delaware, and I've actually met the ladies. I was doing this police training, and they were in it, and they just were jumping up and down, smiling, and afterwards they said, this is us, this is us. And so here we are in 2020. Look how successful this program has been, and it was it was initiated by law enforcement. And then the Handle with Care program, which is pretty well known in our state, where its home and origination was the West Virginia Center for Children's Justice. And basically Handle with Care allows a partnership between local school leadership and local law enforcement, where all the law enforcement do is give a heads up by contacting the school in whatever way the communication is established, and tell the school principal that Joey Smith, Susie Brown, just handle with care, so that the next day that the school knows that when the child comes in that there was some sort of justice involvement. It's not a rumor mill. We don't get all the details. It's just a simple heads up for the educators to know that that child might be a little bit off that day because of some of the things they were involved in. So we're going to watch a simple little roll call video that is available to help police understand Handle with Care. All right, so Handle with Care is certainly a well-known trauma-informed policing program, and we're excited to be a part of helping roll out the Governor Lee's Handle with Care law. Some of the national work that I do, other states are taking notice of this coming into place. I believe New Jersey governor was passing some action for Handle with Care to be rolled out. So right now I'm working with the Tennessee Association of Chiefs of Police to help provide some training available, like the one you're attending today, to law enforcement. Handle with Care is an excellent trauma-informed intervention. All right, then we have my friend Chief David Roddy in Chattanooga, the chief of the Chattanooga Police Department. He is a great one to understand trauma-informed policing practices. And he told me that when he became chief at the department, that they did an assessment of the department weaknesses, and they noticed that many of the crimes that they were involved in Chattanooga were involving youth. And one of the things that they saw in that assessment was that they did not have effective police partnering programs with the youth, where the officers were getting to know the youth and building relationships. So they determined there was a need for a greater connection to youth, and so they rolled out 12, I believe it is, youth programs that officers are required to be involved in one. And we're not going to watch this video, but if you can look it up on YouTube, but it's just an explanation of Bigs in Blue, which is basically Big Brother, Big Sister, which most people know about how that works. But Chief Roddy himself is one of the Bigs in Blue for his department, where he mentors a student every year. Okay, then we have the Martinsburg Initiative. I was privileged in August to go to Martinsburg, West Virginia, to train the Martinsburg Police Department. The Martinsburg Initiative was a police and school community partnership that's been so successful that now they are writing up an implementation guide for the CDC, where more cities can roll out a program of similar fashion. And it began by a partnership that Chief Richardson initiated with the school district, which he's now retired. I did meet him in that visit. The new chief there was a part of the training as well, but then they built other organizations in their network that serve children as well. And so the effort was that children that could be involved in some terms that I heard when I went to work for the police, cradle to prison pipeline or school to prison pipeline, that because of this initiative, that these children are less likely to succumb to some of those scientific predictions about their life because of ACEs. They're actually mitigating the effect of that through a police and schools partnership. And then we have the Norfolk, Virginia Police, the Chief Larry Boone in 2017 initiated what they call the Clergy Patrol. And even though they have chaplains, a part of the police department, they just put out a call for members of faith leaders of any kind of denomination to be involved. And what they do is it's basically a free resource to the department, where pastors do ride-alongs with the officers. And when the officer is in a situation and feels that it's safe for the minister to get out, oftentimes the ministers in their calming way are a big help in de-escalating individuals who have escalated emotions. And then one of the areas that it's also been effective is many times the pastors know of, family members or auntie or grandma may attend their neighborhood church, and sometimes where they had youth that were out just kind of running the streets at night, they were able to pull them into a youth basketball, an inner-city basketball league, and some of those type of more positive actions, instead of the young people ended up involved with the juvenile justice system. So that's a good example. And then we want to talk about community trauma. I said when we started the training that this training was to help us to learn about trauma, but then the three types of trauma that officers are involved with is reducing trauma on scene, particularly for children, and then reducing community trauma, and then we're going to talk about the officers' trauma. So now we're going to shift gears and look at how officers can do some simple steps to reduce community trauma through developing cultural competencies. So we need to know the cultural makeup of our communities. We need to be proactive to build relationships with the key leaders of every demographic. You know, when we're equitable and have inclusion and diversity in our police approach, then we're going to make sure that the voices, you know, of every demographic in our community is at the table and a part of our planning. We want to increase local capacity, develop partnerships, and enable the partners to develop local solutions to local problems, and then begin to practice bias-free policing by treating people in a similar, respectful fashion. So what is cultural competency? Well, here's a definition here from Dr. Udo. It says to be culturally competent doesn't mean you're an authority in the values and beliefs of every culture. What it means is that you hold a deep respect for cultural differences that are eager to learn and willing to accept that there are many ways of viewing the world. So what is culture? Culture is defined as a system of shared values, beliefs, and rituals that are leaned on and passed on through generations of families and social groups. And I know here in the community I live in, I was totally unaware until I went to work for the police department that we have a large group of Liberians that live in our community. We have a large group. We have a very large Hispanic population. We even have a Head Start that works all around the schedule of the migrant farmers that come in and work the strawberry and the tomato farms locally, that run their school, the Head Start, from July to October, all around the harvesting season. And this is a program made available to the Hispanic families. And so police no longer can be unaware of nor build relationships with the different cultures and ethnicities that are represented in their community. So why should we develop cultural competencies? Well, two jobs that I've worked in my career, one in law enforcement and one in healthcare, I became aware that federal law requires law enforcement that receive federal assistance that they have a communication system in place that if someone from any language needs to communicate an emergency, that the police are able to understand that. And the same is true in healthcare. If someone presents in healthcare in the emergency room or has a health need, healthcare needs to be able to understand and communicate with that individual. And also, police serve a diverse public. The sworn, statement of an officer is to serve and protect, and that means to serve and protect all of our community. And so police need to understand that there are some things in the diversity of our community that it's important to recognize these cultural differences. And then also building community trust will positively impact policing. And residents are more likely to be cooperative with law enforcement when they perceive mutual trust and respect. Sometimes individuals that move to our communities, here in Johnson City, we have a very large Veterans Administration. We have a very large College of Medicine, College of Pharmacy. And so we have people from all over the world coming in to attend our medical school. And sometimes individuals are moving from a country where police are largely known to be corrupt, where they take bribes and payoffs. And so if you're coming into a country with that lens and perception of police, you're not necessarily going to reach out to police for help. And so it's important for us in law enforcement to understand these different competencies and then begin to build mutual respect where there's going to be a greater sense of cooperation, and that everyone benefits in the community from building these connections. All right, so here we're going to see a video from the U.S. Department of Justice on how this can be done. All right, so really a great example, a great program from the U.S. Department of Justice, just rolled out as recently as 2017 in Erie, Pennsylvania. And so I'm privileged to have had some similar experience. We did not call it by that name, but when I worked for police, the chief that I've served under is retired now, but we were approached by our local president of the NAACP after the Ferguson shooting, and he came to see our chief and said, Chief, how could we build these relationships and put our community ahead of any kind of mistrust or misuse or abuse? And so the chief had reached out to me to be a part of a group that became known as Community Roundtable, and we met every month, and my job was to help bring in an inclusive group. We reached out to every different kind of faith, our Jewish community, our Muslim community, our Protestant, our Catholic. We had the local FBI attending. We had university leaders, members of government, local government were invited. We had youth attending. And actually, we publicized the meeting date. It met once a month on a Thursday when we publicized it so anyone could come. And I'll tell you, there were times when the officers, the Baltimore riots and the shootings in Dallas and all, that I would go home from these meetings and just tell my husband, I really felt proud to live in a community where we could have so many diverse groups in a room and having honest conversations and building true friendships. And so we started a program. There is a national program called Coffee with a Cop. So we rolled it out here where there's no agenda, no speeches, just conversation. And we held these with downtown business merchants. I'd seen on the social media feed of the police department now, even though I'm no longer affiliated, they recently had one with the female officers. And I think they might have had female business owners that did one around. We did these in inner city churches. We did them at the senior center. We're just officers showing up for a cup of coffee. One thing we found is a lot of our merchants, they would donate the coffee just to be able to host one in their business or in their shopping area. And then we started programs like Lunch Buddies, where officers were, contacted. We were contacted by some of the local schools of kids that really just need a few minutes of mentoring each week. And so some of our officers signed up for Lunch Buddies. We also were a very large present at cultural events, the Umoja Festival in September. Also, we started in 2015, the first ever Martin Luther King Unity March, which still exists to this day. And it's attended by the mayor, the university president, the chief of police, and so many of the faith community are involved in it. Actually, the years I was involved, it turned into more like a prayer walk where different pastors would lead in prayer over the streets as we marched for a couple of miles, and then the Tri-Pride rally, and then the faith community. So we really try to have a genuine connection to every demographic in our community to hear the concerns and to be able to take policing through a lens that was much broader than maybe just our own individual story. And so we need to know as law enforcement that respect is a public safety technique. When we're establishing respect between ourselves and our community members, it must be a priority. And so, as we proceed in the training, I want you to think about, as a member of law enforcement, what type of steps are you taking to proactively achieve respect in a situation where you respond? And so, thinking about sometimes there's better outcomes in interviews with individuals and investigations when we've fostered this idea of respect. All right, so now another trauma-responsive approach for law enforcement is tactical breathing. This actually comes from the International Association of Chiefs of Police. They recommend that every officer knows the value of tactical breathing. Now, some of the people on the call today, and certainly the TCCY staff, do a lot of building strong brain training, and the deep breathing is something that mental health experts have used for years to escalate or de-escalate someone. We use it in school. When I'm training educators, I call it star breathing, and we talk about breathing in and out around the shape of a star. But to officers, we frame it up as tactical breathing. So it's a simple way to help a child or an adult regain focus and a sense of control by just taking a few deep breaths. And this is also helpful to the officers themselves. Tactical breathing is a tool widely deployable. It's not going to cost our department anything except a little bit of your time attending this training, and it's useful in many situations. Why is it important? Because when children witness or experience violence, they may feel anxious, confused, or overwhelmed. And that's going to result in people having a shallow breaths, taking quick, short, shallow breaths. And often you've probably seen people hyperventilate on scene. These shallow breaths can actually heighten the sense of anxiety. So by tactical breathing, the officers just ask people to stop, take a few deep breaths, breathe in through your mouth, hold it, breathe out through your nose. Since I've been teaching about tactical breathing, I received an email from a local SRO who was called to the principal's office after a young child in elementary school had gotten into a fight, and the principal wanted the officer to talk to the child. And after hearing the value of tactical breathing, the officer took the young child outside, said, let's sit down on the curb here, and said, I want you to practice blowing up a balloon. And that officer didn't have a balloon around at all, but he was giving the child that idea of practicing blowing up that balloon because he knew he needed to get the child from the downstairs brain of fight, flight, and freeze into the upstairs brain, and a simple gesture like the tactical breathing was going to make a difference. So we need to remember in our tool belt, along with empathy, we need to think about using the tactical breathing. Some other steps that you can do to reduce trauma on scene is to engage the person, develop a rapport. Again, I know when I worked in healthcare, my office was located in a children's hospital, and we had a team there totally dedicated to helping children navigate sometimes painful, sometimes uncomfortable, sometimes scary situations. And this group were masters of distraction. You know, they'd go to a scene where a child's having a chemo port put in, and they would bring some puppets, or they would have get in there and do some storytelling. And even though the child was still uncomfortable while this medical procedure was taking place, these wonderful healthcare workers, they would help to soothe that child just by engaging them and developing some rapport. And then we need to be able to practice in a calm, soothing environment to give undivided attention, unhurried attention as possible. And then allow those that were serving in this situation control and choice. If the next situations that are going to unfold from where they are involve some choice, maybe you're going to have to arrest a caregiver. So minor age children are there. Well, certainly Child Protective Services are going to be involved, but it might be possible that another support person, that a relative or a nearby neighbor or a trusted friend is able to come and to be present as some of these things are happening. All right, so the next couple of slides are effective police responses, age-appropriate ways to reduce trauma on scene for children, and these come from the International Chiefs Association website. Actually, I believe it was in 2012, ICAP and Yale University partnered together to create some ways that law enforcement could reduce trauma for children exposed to violence, and this content here comes from that toolkit they created. So infants, you know, we may think when an infant is on the scene, well, that infant is not being traumatized. We'll think again, when an infant is being on a scene that's chaotic, they're picking up the stimuli from the caregiver. If a caregiver is screaming or holding them, you know, that little child is picking up the cues from that caregiver. So what do we want to do? We want to guide the infant to be moved to the least chaotic part of the scene. We want to show concern for the child's safety by talking to the caregiver. You know, that can be a good way to have them move the child. You know, ma'am, sir, we want to be able to reduce the trauma here for your child. Let's step over here where we're not in the center of all the activity going on. And then remind the caregiver themselves how important it is for them to become calm in order to support their children. and then help caregivers decrease their own distress. And then when caregivers are not able to respond to the child, maybe if it's a traffic crash and they're maybe unconscious, or maybe you arrive at a scene where a caregiver's passed out because of drug activity, then we're going to need to be able to find alternative caregivers to attend to the infant. All right, what about a preschooler, toddlers and preschooler? Well, number one, you want to ensure the child is physically safe and sufficiently monitored. And we want to, again, help the caregiver to become calm and in control themselves. We want to help the caregiver find a place they can sit and address them in a calm, respectful, but authoritative manner. And just ask them to have a seat. And that when children, when you're speaking to children, if you feel, officer, that it doesn't, if it isn't going to possibly, affect your own safety, it's a good idea to get down on a child's level by kneeling or sitting or at least squatting down to kind of look eye level to a child. And then again, if the caregiver present on the scene is unresponsive, then we need to find an alternative caregiver for helping through that process. So in 2019, I trained the Oklahoma City Police Department on this training. This training is actually certified in the state of Oklahoma for officer in-service credit. Oklahoma City Police have 1,200 officers, and so I made 3 trips out there and did a train the trainer so then they could finish up training all the officers in their department. But they told me, the training captain told me at the end of the training, that when I shared the slides that I'm giving you right now, that they put them on laminated cards that the officers could carry in their wallet until they were familiarized with some of these ways to reduce the trauma on scene for the children. Okay, what about a school-age child, 6 to 12? Well, again, we want to attempt to limit the child's exposure to further out-of-control behavior. Also, it's okay to talk to kids, find out what questions they may have, and talk in a plain language about what has happened. Keep them in a location on scene where they're safe. And if the child's so distressed they can't even begin to verbalize, then that's a good time to practice blowing up the balloon or teach the tactical breathing. And then support the caregivers in meeting the child's needs, even if it's necessary to bring in an alternative caregiver if the caregiver is not responsive. Okay, and then what about teenagers? You know, it's very important, officers, that we take the behaviors of teenagers very seriously. If you make an arrest of a caregiver and you have a 14, 15-year-old on scene and they tell you that they feel unsafe about who may come by later in the day around the drug activity, you know, these teenagers probably know when their parent owes money to a drug dealer. You know, they know when a violent boyfriend or you know, a relationship is going to be coming by. And so we need to validate and take seriously concerns of youth when they might express a fear for their safety. And then, you know, think back to when you were a teenager. You know, did you want to be humiliated in front of your friends? So officers, it's important to be able to effectively communicate with teenagers. If you'll communicate in a way that allows the teenager to, in front of their friends particularly, to, you know, not to be put down in a situation. And then you might be surprised if you show respect to a teenager that the teenager is very likely to be very cooperative and respectful back to the member of law enforcement. Okay, so this a friend of mine now is retired special agent of the FBI in the state of Mississippi, and he came over in the summer of 2019 while I was training the Johnson City Police Department. After I actually went to work in healthcare, the police department I used to work for reached out and asked me if I would do 12 sessions for their annual their annual in-service to train the Johnson City Police in this material. And so the FBI special agent sent me this little photo. So this shows that you're still doing the things, the perimeters, you're still doing the things that your job is involved in, but there are ways that we can reduce trauma on scene. So here's a brave Mississippi firefighter who has a child responded to a car crash, and you see all the debris there laying around, laying in the gravel, and it's not very apparent that maybe there's an adult caregiver right there on scene. So we don't really know everything that's happened there, but they're waiting on Wings transport to bring this child into safety. And notice that the fireman, the EMS, is watching Happy Feet with that little child on the video. Some of the gestures that we can use, simple things like learning to celebrate. You know, the many years I worked for police and all the community programs we did, I never one time had a child ask me if they could be photographed with me. Why? They wanted me to help set up a situation where they could be photographed with the officer in the uniform or see their hat or sit in their front seat of their car. And so officers, when you're celebrating, high fives or words that are encouraging to children, that's going to go a long way in establishing your role as a community guardian. And then also comforting. We've probably said the word comfort a dozen times in this training because that is key to remaining in the upstairs part of your brain. And then also collaborate when there are options. And then listen, just showing a genuine interest. And then inspire. You may not feel like you're Superman or Superwoman, but many times law enforcement, actually I read a true story a while back that there was a young person in Louisville, Kentucky, a young African-American child in Louisville that had some interaction with the law, and an officer that responded said to this young man, "Do you like to fight?" And this young man responded, "Yes, I like to fight." And so this officer knew about an inner-city boxing collaborative, and he introduced that young child instead of, being out in the situation where he could have gotten into further trouble. He's got him involved in this inner-city boxing, and do you know who that young child was? Muhammad Ali. And that is the true story of how he was introduced to his boxing career, was through the community work of a police officer. All right, now the next video we see is about 20 minutes long. It's an actual officer training video from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network on 5 core messages officers need to know when you respond to domestic violence calls and children are on scene. And then after we finish that, we're going to be talking about officer self-care and wrap it up. All right, such an insightful video. I just appreciate National Child Traumatic Stress Network for bringing that together. So the 5 core messages when officers respond to a domestic violence scene is that all the children are affected, but they may show it in different ways. So in that little scenario, you had the little boy hiding upstairs or in a room just with the door shut and all, but then you have the other sister out there watching TV, kind of like, glazed over. And as the video pointed out, it's likely then by her behavior that this is something she's used to seeing. And that officers need to realize that children living with domestic violence have complicated feelings about their parents. And again, back to the 911 call that I heard, as a mother and a grandmother, that's what gave me the idea that who could be the voice of reason to that child in that situation? Because, amazingly, we know from divorce, information about divorce, parents when they get divorced, parents when they're addicted to drugs, that children continue to blame themselves, that it's their fault for these situations. And the same is true with domestic violence. So an officer can step in there and be the voice of reason to say to that child, no, you did the right thing. If you ever feel unsafe, you call us. And then officers need to know, number 3, is that children worry that they're responsible. So kind of hand in hand with having the complicated feelings, they're worrying that it's their fault. But most of all, we need to know that police officers really matter to kids. And I love the part in the video where the officer said that many times they get a thank you from the child and how nice that feels. And that there are simple things that officers can do on scene to help reduce the impact of trauma. And that is certainly helpful for you to know what are your local resources, what are other opportunities that might be available to this family, and by helping to maybe give out some information. I know when I was at the police department, we had brochures and cards that were in the officer squad cars with how to contact the Family Justice Center, where it was located, what were the office hours, what you could expect when you went there. So these things, by just some simple preparation and understanding the complexity of what's going on when children are present, you can reduce the trauma. All right, what about when children are being arrested, parents are being arrested in front of a child? Some ways that officers can reduce that trauma is by building and maintaining, knowing that building and maintaining positive relationships with children is a good crime prevention strategy. Because officers, if you stay on that job another 10, 15 years, you know what? Those children are going to be the adults that you're serving. So by building some positive relationships with children is always a win-win, because children that learn to trust police more are likely to cooperate in the future. And then again, for a child, whatever the reason that they are going to have a loss of a parent, even if it's from crime and incarceration, to that child, that's traumatic. So what are a few practical things you can do? Well, you can let the child know the parent's arrest, number 1, is not their fault. And that's the very same thing that we saw in the domestic violence situation. And that we need to know also that what is happening to their parent by just giving some description of the services or where they're going to be able to have contact with the parent following an arrest, if that's even going to be possible. If it's likely, you don't have to know the date and the time, because I know certainly there's going to be situations with the court date, maybe an initial hearing, maybe a setting of the bail or something like that. But maybe you could just give the child that there is a system in place that you will be able to contact the parent, or they'll be able to contact you, and that there would be a time that there could be even a visitation. And then for the child to know with whom they're going to stay while their parent is incarcerated, and to let a child know that it's okay to love their parent, but sometimes to feel angry, and that people that make choices in life, there can be consequences. All right, we're going to wrap this training up in the next few minutes and then open it up for a few of the questions that you might have by talking about the third kind of trauma that can be reduced by law enforcement understanding trauma-informed care. So that is officer self-care. So, many of you have probably flown on a plane. I haven't been on one since before COVID, but I know travel is opening up a bit. But if you fly on a plane, you're going to hear this statement made by an airline employee that in the unlikely event of a loss of cabin pressure, oxygen mask will fall from the panel above your head. And notice that they always say, put your own mask on before you go to help someone else. And the reason for that is if the cabin pressure is such where you lose, we have no oxygen, you're going to pass out. And so you're not going to really be much help to anyone around, okay? So let's just talk about some of the facts about trauma and officers. Because officers respond to confrontation, conflict, and violence, they're exposed to trauma and death more proportionally than any other type of profession. These traumatic experiences can carry significant mental health risks, including suicide, which disproportionately affects the law enforcement professionals. In 2018, 159 officers took their own life, which made death by suicide more likely than death from firearms or traffic-related accidents combined. And so I know working for police, oftentimes these other causes of death is what is the concentration of officer training. Officers have to qualify every year out on the range with their service revolver. If you have a taser, then you have to be tased. You know, there's driving schools and all these things. But for too long, there's not been the attention to the officer mental wellness like what now we're seeing, and it's taking its toll on officers. Officers are also more likely than the general population to exhibit PTSD, which is the same as our soldiers returning from war. Some more facts is that in August of 2019, a report from Blue Help, which was about halfway through the year last year, reported that the number of officer suicides were already at an increased rate from that of 2018. So vicarious trauma, that is the expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss every day and not be touched by it. And this is unrealistic as being expected to walk through water and not get wet. So self-care must be a priority. And I've not been able to check through the list of our attendees today, but if we have supervisors on here, captains on here, chiefs on here, this culture must start at the leadership. When I went to train the Oklahoma City Police Department, they were rolling out a peer program for officers, and many of their officers that had wanted to be in the peer support program, they had on their uniforms a designation that said peer, and they were rolling out this program. So the leadership needs to assume responsibility that officers prioritize self-care. Organizations have an ethical mandate of duty to train wherein the workers are taught about the potential negative effects of their work and then how to cope. You know, one of my daughter-in-laws, her father is a lineman, and he's worked on crews around the world, actually, particularly in the Caribbean and some of the states some of the areas hardest hit by hurricanes. And, you know, the safety training that they go through, because if you're up a pole and you do something wrong, 10,000 volts going through your body, there may not be a chance to relive that situation. And so on the front, they're brought into all the ways that, you know, we need to be aware of safety. And while I know police departments go at great length to do that for an officer's physical safety, we must raise more attention to the officer's mental well-being as well. And then beyond the officer, that there are also negative effects for the trauma to the families. I know, again, working with officers, that when there are tensions nationally between police and communities, you can look at the social media feed of family members, you know, requesting prayer for their officer and their lives taking a huge amount of stress just by being associated with the profession of law enforcement. Family members also may develop anxiety about their officers' safety and well-being. So department leaders should initiate this holistic approach to health and well-being and include support system for spouses, partners, and family members. And here's some interesting data that communities suffer when police officers are not healthy and well. That fatigue actually impairs decision-making, and tired officers are more likely to escalate their encounters and make mistakes. Officers who are mentally and physically fit are more productive and receive fewer complaints regarding the use of force. Improved mental health and emotional well-being are associated with better outcomes in police encounters. And so the workplace culture is enormously influential as a factor in addressing vicarious trauma. And, you know, professionals, as much as I've done this training since 2017, so I'm in a third year now of bringing trauma-informed policing to law enforcement. I've trained officers in North Carolina, West Virginia, Tennessee, and Oklahoma. And in many of those situations, there is a serious under attention to the amount of officer wellness. One department, I won't disclose where they are located, in another state, the junior officers were begging me to talk to the chief after hearing this training before the chief attended, and the chief only attended 20 minutes of it, so he didn't hear the rest of the part about self-care. But they were seriously concerned that their department lacked the resources or the attention for officer well-being. So we're not going to show the video here for sake of time, but there's the Vicarious Trauma Toolkit, and that's a great resource to show you how to do an inventory if your department is addressing self-care in the way it ought to. And then we also see PTSD, which we're familiar with hearing, particularly where our veterans are concerned, but that can happen through direct exposure to trauma or indirect exposure. So a news article in the Wall Street Journal in the recent years, it highlighted the skyrocketing costs of police misconduct cases and the growing public distrust of the use of force. And we've been hearing that now for months. And in this article, the analysts used data gathered from public records and the reports that from among the U.S. cities with the 10 largest police departments in the last few years, there have been an increase of 48% of police misconduct lawsuits. And the authors went on in this article to tell that those cities had paid out over $1 billion over 5 years in these cases with alleged beatings, shooting, and wrongful imprisonment. But notice what they tied to that behavior. The research showed in the area of police performance that psychological and physiological stress during critical incidents shape the outcome of the incident, whether it be for good or for bad, and that maladaptive stress responses during a critical incident put the officer and members of the public at risk of injury. Maladaptive stress responsive also can negatively affect the officer's health over time. So one of the things that I want to recommend is the use of Provider Resilience app. So when I was training in Oklahoma City, boom, they downloaded it on 1,200 phones. It's a free app. You can go to the App Store. And very quickly, because we're at our time here, the Provider Resilience app is kind of a simple tool like Map My Run, Map My Ride, and it's going to send you little daily reminders of have you had your exercise, have you done your stretching, here's a meditation. But the main thing I want you to know about this app is it has the professional quality of life scale on it. And I was actually recommending this through our HR departments when I worked in healthcare, because anyone that works in a compassion profession needs to be able to assess the stress that they are holding in as far as their job. So here's a couple of screenshots of the app and what you can expect. And the professional quality of life scale is about 15 questions, and you move through it very rapidly. Things like, have you taken a day off? Have you laughed at something today? You just go yes, no, and it immediately brings up the score for one of three things: compassion satisfaction, compassion fatigue, burnout, or most dangerous to officers is secondary trauma. So what is compassion satisfaction? Well, that's the fact that today I felt like a hero. You know, we were able to rescue a child, you know, or found a runaway youth, or, you know, we were able to resuscitate someone that fell into a pool, or delivered a set of twins in an airport. And so you go away feeling like you've contributed and you and your team are making a difference. But then there's burnout, which is the element of compassion fatigue. You start to have feelings of hopelessness and difficulties dealing with the work. And these gradual feelings of negativity begin to have an onset where you just can't shake them. And then that can lead to the secondary traumatic stress, Was this a side effect or result of seeing or hearing about acts of cruelty? And that can have a permanent and profound change in workers, and they mimic PTSD. So some of the health problems that are caused by stress, you can see through the list there. Depression, anxiety, a loss of sleep. Did you know, officer, if you're not sleeping at night, your immune system is not rebuilding itself. There are a lot of health benefits to us being able to get a good night's sleep. And so some of the red flags around traumatic stress is you had a call that was traumatic and it's 6 weeks out now and you're not feeling any better. You're disconnected at home. You're having flashbacks and nightmares, and you have a difficult time connecting to others, suicidal thoughts, and you want to do things to avoid the remembering of that particular event. So some of the tips that you can think about is that just know, officer, by ignoring all that is not going to help it to go away. And that people in different situations are going to react differently, but ignoring your feelings will actually slow the recovery. So earlier on in the training, I mentioned that when I trained the Bristol, Tennessee Police Department, one night I was training all the reserve officers, and a female reserve officer came to me at the end and thanked me for this training. And she told me that she works by day as a PA in a local hospital in the emergency room. So she's used to health emergencies and the such, and she handles it as part of her career. She expects it as part of her career. But in the first 2 weeks, she was a reserve officer. She was doing a ride along, and they were the first car to respond to a horrific traffic accident. When she told me about it, I actually remembered some of the details. It closed down one of the local interstate for several hours. It involved a tractor trailer and many cars. And when they responded, they came up on the tractor trailer, and as they got out of the vehicle and began to look around, they could not find the body of the tractor trailer driver, and he had been ejected out of the truck during the accident. And what had happened is the next car that came along at interstate speed picked up that driver's body and drug it out about a mile or so away, where finally the body was found and recovered. And she began to describe what that situation was like. And she said, I felt out of body for a couple of weeks because of the horror of that scene. Now, if you look at the general orders of most of the police departments, many police departments only say that you have to have a debriefing if you use your service revolver. And actually, there'll be an internal investigation in most police departments. But officers, the day-to-day job here locally, we have very little train activity, but every year there's 5 or 6 fatalities where someone, usually maybe a homeless individual or intoxicated, gets on that train track and they're met by an oncoming train and their life is ended. And these young officers roll up there to a horrific scene. And so I want you to know today that processing the trauma related to your job is not a character weakness. Sometimes I feel like that's the most important statement I make in this entire 3 hours of training, is it's not a character weakness. And if you'll use the professional quality of life scale that's on that Provider Resilience app, it's not having to go to your supervisor. It's not having to go to up the command chain. All it does is, like my husband has a little device like a pencil. He can put on the tire stem of any tire, and it reads the pressure. And so this is some little tools we're giving you today to help you to know how are you handling the pressure of your job. So a couple other recovery tips is to do things that are normal. One time an officer told me after training, said, you know what, if the only friends you have are police officers, it's good for your health if you have a few friends that aren't. And I thought that was such wise advice. And also you need to make handling the stress of the job a priority. And here's a couple of tips as well. And then my last slide, second to last slide here, is that in counseling, I'm involved in a faith setting as a volunteer counselor, and sometimes we'll use this little handout just to illustrate that sometimes our life can get out of balance. So if I was to hand you this sheet today, it's called the Wheel of Life, that we would see these several areas that are colored in: career, financial, spiritual, and the different ones, and it would be like a hub of a wheel, and they were the different areas are kind of poking out there like spokes on a wheel. And I would hand it to someone and I would give these simple instructions: connect the lines on all the areas in your life that you give some regular attention to. And do you know what, ladies and gentlemen? There would be many of us on this training today that would turn that sheet back in with basically a flat tire, that maybe we're not giving attention to an area or two in our life. Maybe our family life is suffering because we're so committed in our job. We're picking up every overtime shift. But yet, what is that doing? That's even exposing us to more trauma. So considering the wheel of life is a great way to think about balance. So what are some resources? Well, every department, you have your own peers. You know, when I worked at the police, my office was right up against the roll call room. And I would see officers come in through the day and sit in the office of the watch commander, or sometimes a couple of officers would bring in a lunch and sit there in the roll call room. And I know on more occasions, what are they doing? They're just talking about what is going on that day and some of their feelings about it. But officers, you must have your own, even if your department does not support that. And I'm hopeful that more conversation around this is going to change that. But you need to have your own safety plan. And what steps are you going to take to make sure your mental wellness is a priority? And so here are a couple of national resources that you can call. What's interesting about this is some of these hotlines are actually staffed by retired law enforcement who realized the critical need, and some of them went back to school and became LSC, licensed clinical social workers, and they man these lines, and you can call these confidential lines for free and just talk about the things that are happening on your job and process the stress of the job. All right, now there's the resource list for everything that this training came from and my contact information and the post number. So a few minutes over, and I apologize for that. But again, I want to thank Richard and his wonderful TCCY team for allowing me to present, and also for each of you that has attended today. So I think we have time for a few questions, and I'll turn it over to the moderator.
Thank you so much, Becky. We do have a question. It is, how do you deal with sexual trauma from other cultures who have migrated to America who still marry off-child brides?
Okay, is that written somewhere? Say that again. Say that.
Okay, it's, how do you deal with sexual trauma from other cultures who have migrated to America who still marry off-child brides?
Okay, now, I mean, even if the custom is marrying off the child bride, I mean, you know, I'm not sure what context law enforcement would be involved, but if that is a major issue, I would find out what is the jurisdiction as far as human trafficking in our country or child pornography. I know those are federal charges, and I'm not sure when someone's an immigrant, even if it's their culture, if the laws now center around what's you know, what we do in America, if that would take jurisdiction. I would certainly, as an officer, if maybe a mother of that young child that's going to be you know, married off or whatever, I would know my resources for domestic violence and that kind of thing. I would say, since most often the child pornography, crimes against children are federal charges, I would encourage whoever's asking that question to probably contact the local FBI and see if in America, if the culture takes precedent or the actual laws. My guess, unless they're a diplomat, it's going to be the laws. But good question. I think you stumped the band there.
Thank you. I don't see another question, but I do have a comment.
Okay.
Vicarious trauma is extremely important to address in the many fields that all of us employ. Witnessing my first homicide years ago, I did not think it would be I did not think I would be affected as much as I was because of my training. The training took over during the incident, but afterwards, there was no training for the after effects.
Well, I appreciate who was honest and just transparent to share that. And I didn't know what to expect when I started doing trauma-informed policing training in other states. And honestly, I've been very surprised at the lack of the resources for just the day-to-day. You know, when one officer tried to resuscitate a 2-year-old that fell in a swimming pool and was unable to. And that officer has a 2-year-old of themselves. And it's hard to just go home and shake those incidents off. One officer, after I finished training, he told me to thank the chief for providing this training to them. And he said, I'm a 22-year veteran and recently responded to a college where an 18-year-old died of natural causes, but the roommate of the 18-year-old called all the family, the grandmother, the parents. So here I have coming into this college apartment, all the family members, and it was just so, it was so emotional at this child's death, and said it took me about an hour to work that scene and process the papers, get the examiner there, and then my very next call was smash pumpkins, and he said, I wanted to smash every pumpkin on that porch, but I had to roll over there and be calm and cool, collected, and he said, it's really important that we stop and think about how officers have to, much of the time, feel like they have to soldier on. So thank you, officer, for that comment.
Okay. If anyone has any additional questions, please type them in the chat now. I'm looking at that. I would like to mention that we have the Tennessee Post number, again, is 20-72. So if we don't have any other questions, I'd like to thank you, Becky, for the phenomenal presentation. I always enjoy hearing you speak. Appreciate you sharing how we can all be more mindful in taking a trauma-informed approach in our interactions with others, and also all the self-care techniques. On behalf of all the regional coordinators, we would like to thank you for joining us today and engaging in this wonderful presentation. As a reminder, if you're calling in today, or if you are a law enforcement personnel and watching as a group, please email Susan Cope at tn.gov. That's susan.cope@tn.gov. Please email her your name and request for either a CEU, post, or participant certificate. And again, we just thank everyone for joining us today, and we hope you have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you, Becky. Richard had to step off, but he said great job, and thank you so much.
Well, thank you for helping me.
Thank you, Becky.
Good to see everybody. Thank you, Susan, and everybody for all your help. Have a good weekend.
One second, Becky. Susan, was there something we were going to ask Becky at the end of the training?
You were going to ask her if she wanted to do a run-through for the next training on the 20th.
Oh, well, we could.
Well, the next presentation, could we have a list of the videos, the slides that have the videos? If you'll send that to me.
Okay.
And if you are more comfortable running through it, that's fine. But really, mainly, we just need the list of videos.
Okay, I'll send you the list. I wondered, actually, Jonathan and I are going to be at the beach that week, and I wondered if there was a way earlier in that week we could meet for a few minutes, because the internet's usually good there, but I'll feel a lot more peace of mind if we could do a run through that week. So maybe Monday or Tuesday, or you guys just shoot me a few options.
Well, I think the training is on Tuesday.
Oh, Tuesday. Okay, then Monday or Friday. Well, we won't get there till later Friday, but I feel pretty confident, or I would have not accepted it. But well, would you rather not do it Monday?
Oh, Monday's fine.
No, that's fine.
Okay, let's see. That would be Monday, the 19th. Could we maybe do it in the morning?
What time? And I'll see if we have availability in the...
9 o'clock.
Is that Eastern time or Central time?
It's Eastern.
Okay.
Or 10 o'clock. I know for you all Central, that'll be pretty early. So...
we have availability for WebEx.
Okay, what time, Bill, do we have availability?
All morning.
Until
morning.
Well, you all tell me, and thank you, Bill, for all your help. I got your email with the videos, so I'm going to put them in on a flash drive. So how about split the difference, say 8:30 Central, 9:30 for, is that good?
That's good. I'll add it to the calendar.
And somebody will send me a link.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
And Becky, we had talked about this earlier about the video for posting that on our website. Do you think I should call Captain Leonard and just confirm with her that it would be okay for that post-training to rest on our video on our webpage?
To call who now? Because I'm working with Maggie Duncan.
Well, Captain Elizabeth Leonard got the post certification for us from the Springfield Police Department. Is that how I should go through that, or is it Maggie?
Well, no, Maggie would just be, I mean, we're going to post a video of it that any officer can see once she gets her Handle with Care website up. I mean, I would feel like this event was coordinated and paid for by TCCY. So whatever's consistent with what you all normally do, because I know there's been a few times I've missed one of your events and I saw it on archives, you know.
Yeah. Okay, we'll just go ahead then and post it on our website.
Okay.
And make it available.
Sure. Okay, what did I say on the 19th? I said 9:30 would be Eastern time?
Yes.
Okay. It's on there. And if I don't show the camera, it'll be because I'm in vacation mode.
I think it might be why I'm not showing my camera either, Becky, but that's a whole different conversation.
Oh, okay. I might be in jammy mode.
They can't see it anyway.
Oh, they can't. Okay. Yeah, you don't really want to know my outfit right now, but anyway, thank you all. You're the best, and I always really count it a privilege to work with you.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you. You always do a great job, Becky.
Yeah, great job.
Thank
you, Becky.
Okay. Have a good weekend.
Bye.
Susan,
Bye.
Jill, Christy, y'all always rock. Obviously.
Melissa,
Love
enjoy
you.
your...
See you.